Hey friends, about 70% of folks watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know where you're tuning in from. The wind whispered through the towering pines as I pulled my weathered pickup truck into the small parking lot at the edge of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It was early September 2024, and the air carried the first hints of autumn's chill. My name is Warren Hargrove, and at 42 years old, I found myself seeking solace in the vast wilderness of Washington state. The forest loomed before me, a sea of green stretching as far as the eye could see. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, and took a deep breath. The rich scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the city I'd left behind. I'd come here to escape, to find myself again after a bitter divorce that had left me questioning every decision I'd ever made. My ex-wife's words still echoed in my mind. "You're losing yourself, Warren. You're not the man I married." Maybe she was right. Maybe that's why I was here, hoping the forest could help me rediscover who I really was. As I shouldered my heavy backpack, I noticed an old man sitting on a bench near the trailhead. His withered face crinkled into a smile as he nodded in my direction. "Heading out for a long one?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. I nodded. "Yeah, planning to be out there for about a week. Clear my head, you know." The old man's smile faded slightly. "Be careful out there, son. The forest, it has a way of changing a person, not always for the better." A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off with a forced laugh. "I'll keep that in mind." "Thanks." As I started down the trail, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the old man's words had stirred in me. The forest suddenly seemed more ominous, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. The trail wound its way through the dense undergrowth, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of distant mountains. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual chatter of birds was strangely absent, and more than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being watched. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. As I went about the familiar routine of pitching my tent and gathering firewood, I tried to rationalize my growing unease. It was just nerves, I told myself. The stress of the past year catching up with me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, that explanation felt increasingly hollow. The campfire cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own, and every snapping twig in the surrounding forest sent my heart racing. I crawled into my tent that night, zipping the entrance closed as if it could keep out the creeping dread that had taken root in my mind. As I lay there staring at the nylon ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that coming here had been a terrible mistake. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dream. I tossed and turned, haunted by visions of shadowy figures moving just beyond the firelight, always watching, always waiting. And through it all, the old man's words echoed in my mind. The forest has a way of changing a person, not always for the better. Little did I know, as I finally drifted off into a restless slumber, that those words would prove to be more prophetic than I could have ever imagined. I awoke to a world shrouded in mist. The early morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. As I emerged from my tent, stretching muscles stiff from a night of uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the lingering unease from the previous evening. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, I packed up camp and set out deeper into the forest. The trail narrowed as I pressed on, the underbrush grew thicker, more wild. The mist clung to everything, droplets of moisture beating on leaves and spiderwebs alike. It was around midday when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Just off the trail, partially hidden by a fallen log, was a backpack. Not mine. This one was a vibrant blue caked with mud and leaves as if it had been there for some time. Curiosity overrode caution, and I approached, calling out, "Hello. Is anyone there?" Only the muffled echo of my own voice answered. With trembling hands, I unzipped the pack. Inside I found clothes, a water bottle, and a wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to Alila Reeves, a woman in her late 20s with a bright smile that seemed out of place in this gloomy forest. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Someone was missing out here, but for how long? And where were they now? I pulled out my satellite phone, intending to call the ranger station, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. Dead battery, no signal. I couldn't be sure, but the sense of isolation suddenly felt overwhelming. As I stood there debating what to do, sound cut through the stillness. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but mist and trees. Then I noticed them, tracks in the soft earth, leading away from where I'd found the backpack. They are like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too large for any animal I knew inhabited these woods. The claw marks at the edges of each print sent a shiver of primal fear through me. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself following the tracks. They led me off the trail and into the densest part of the forest I'd encountered yet. The trees here were old, their gnarled trunks covered in thick moss, their branches forming a canopy so dense that little light penetrated. As I pushed through the underbrush, my foot caught on something, nearly sending me sprawling to the ground. I arced down and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a camera, its lens cracked, the strap tangled in the roots of a massive pine. With shaking hands, I picked it up. The memory card was still intact. I slipped it into my own camera, and what I saw made my heart stop. The first few photos were typical tourist shots, sweeping vistas, close-ups of interesting plants and insects, but the last image, it was blurry, taken in haste. But I could make out a dark shape moving between the trees. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a hulking, almost human-like silhouette. I nearly dropped the camera, my mind reeling. What was that thing? And, more importantly, what had happened to the person who took this photo? As if in answer, that low growl sounded again, closer this time. Much closer. I stuffed the camera into my pack and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or direction. All I know was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and whatever was out there as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea where I was. The forest around me was unfamiliar, the trail long since lost. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was lost in a forest that suddenly felt a lot less empty and a lot more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The sun was setting, painting the mist with eerie shades of orange and red. I knew I needed to find shelter to regroup and figure out a plan. But as the shadows lengthened and that inhuman growl echoed through the trees once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that my nightmare was only just beginning. As darkness fell, panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was lost, alone, and something was out there, something that defied explanation. My survival training kicked in, reminding me that I needed to find shelter and fast. I stumbled through the deepening gloom using the dim light of my headlamp to navigate. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers snagging my clothes and scratching my skin. Just when I was about to give up hope, the trees thinned and I found myself on the edge of a small clearing. There, bathed in the pale moonlight that had managed to break through the clouds, stood a cabin. It was an old structure, its log walls weathered and its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. The windows were dark, some of them boarded up. Everything about it screamed abandoned. Yet at that moment it looked like salvation. I approached cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the carpet of dead leaves. The porch creaked ominously as I stepped onto it, and I half expected it to collapse under my weight. I tried the door lock. Desperation gave me strength, and I threw my shoulder against the aged wood. Once, twice, and on the third try, the door gave way with a splintering crack. The interior of the cabin was pitch black. I swept my headlamp around, revealing a single room filled with dust-covered furniture, a table, a couple of chairs, a pot-bellied stove in one corner, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It was the walls that caught my attention. Every available surface was covered in strange symbols and markings, etched deeply into the wood. They formed bizarre, swirling patterns that seemed to move in the shifting beam of my light. With a start, I realized that some of the symbols resembled the tracks I had seen earlier, the ones that had led me to the lost camera. A chill ran down my spine as I wondered what kind of person would carve such things and why. I closed the door as best I could, wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. As I explored the cabin further, I found an old kerosene lamp and some matches. The warm glow of the lamp brought little comfort as it illuminated more of the unsettling etchings on the walls. In one corner, partially hidden behind the stove, I found a stack of old newspapers. The dates on them shocked me. The most recent was from 1985, nearly 4 decades ago. One headline caught my eye. Local man claims forest spirit responsible for missing hikers. The article went on to describe a series of disappearances in the area, all blamed on some sort of creature that supposedly protected the forest. I remembered the old man's warning at the trailhead, and a sick feeling settled in my stomach. Was this all connected somehow? The missing hiker's backpack, the strange tracks, the creature in the photograph, and now these carvings and old newspaper stories. The sudden noise outside made me freeze. Something was moving around the cabin, its heavy footsteps crunching on the leaf litter. I heard sniffing like an animal trying to catch a scent. I extinguished the lamp and crouched in the darkest corner of the cabin, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps circled the structure once, twice, before finally moving away into the forest. Long minutes passed before I dared to move. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard for miles. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion took its place. I was safe for the moment, but I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, I would have to venture back out into the forest and face whatever was out there. I lay down on the dusty bed, my mind racing with question. What was that creature? Was it responsible for the missing hiker? And most pressingly, how was I going to get out of this alive? Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with nightmares of dark shapes moving through mist-shrouded trees. Always just out of sight, but drawing ever closer. I woke with a start, disoriented in the dim light filtering through the boarded-up windows. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back, the backpack, the tracks, the creature, and the cabin. I sat up, my body aching from the uncomfortable bed and the stress of the previous day. Sunlight streamed through the cracks of the boards, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the harsh light of day, the cabin seemed less menacing, but the eerie carvings on the walls were a stark reminder of the strangeness I had stumbled into. I knew I needed to find my way back to civilization, but the thought of venturing out into the forest again filled me with dread. I decided to search the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find anything that might help me understand what was going on. In a rickety old dresser, I found a journal. The leather cover was cracked and faded. The pages were yellow with age. I opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The journal belonged to a man named Jeremiah Blackwood. The entries dated back to the 1970s, and as I read, a chill ran down my spine. Jeremiah wrote about the forest, a presence he felt watching him, and encounters with a creature that matched what I had seen in the photograph. Tall, humanoid, but definitely not human. But it was the later entries that truly unsettled me. Jeremiah's writing became more frantic, more paranoid. He wrote about the symbols he was carving into the walls of his cabin, the very symbols that surrounded me now. He claimed they were for protection, that they would keep the creature at bay. The final entry, dated September 15th, 1985, read, "It's too late. I've become what I feared. The forest has claimed me. If you're reading this, run before it takes you to." I closed the journal, my hands shaking. What did it mean? Had Jeremiah lost his mind out here in the wilderness, or was there some truth to his ramblings? The noise outside snapped me out of my thoughts. It was the crack of a branch breaking under a heavy weight. Something was out there. I crept to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature. It was just as the photograph had shown, massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed both human and animal at the same time. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, almost like tree bark, and its eyes were disturbingly human. But what shocked me most was its face. Beneath the inhuman features, I could see a familiarity that shook me to my core. It looked like Jeremiah Blackwood. As I watched, frozen in horror, the creature's gaze locked onto the cabin. For a moment, I was certain it could see me. Then, with surprising grace for something so large, it melted back into the forest. My mind was reeling. Was this what Jeremiah meant in his final entry? Had he somehow transformed into this thing? I slumped to the floor, my back against the wall, trying to make sense of it all. The missing hikers, the strange tracks, the carvings, and the journal. It all pointed to something beyond my understanding. As the day wore on, I found myself poring over Jeremiah's journal again and again, looking for clues to some way to explain what I had seen. But the more I read, the more questions I had. One thing was clear: I couldn't stay in this cabin forever. Sooner or later, I would have to face what was out there. But as the sun began to set once more, casting long shadows across the clearing, I knew that time was running out. I gathered what supplies I could find, some old canned food from a cupboard, a rusty hunting knife, and Jeremiah's journal. As I prepared to leave the relative safety of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. With a deep breath, I opened the cabin door and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Whatever answers lay ahead, I knew I had to find them, for Jeremiah, for the missing hikers, and for myself. The forest at night was a different world. Shadows danced between the trees, and every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the creaking of branches, the occasional hoot of an owl. I moved cautiously, my headlamp cutting a narrow path through the darkness. I had a vague idea of the direction I needed to go to find the main trail, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Landmarks appeared and disappeared in the gloom. More than once I found myself walking in circles, ending up back at the cabin despite my best efforts to move away from it. As the hours wore on, fatigue began to set in. My muscles ached from the constant tension, and every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat. I was just about to give up and make camp for the night when I heard it, a low, mournful sound that was somewhere between a growl and a human moan. My blood ran cold. I knew without a doubt that it was the creature, the thing that had once been Jeremiah Blackwood. The sound came again, closer this time. I could hear the snapping of branches as something large moved through the underbrush. Fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The creature's roar echoed behind me, spurring me on despite the burning in my lungs and the lead-like feeling in my legs. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out of the tree line and found myself on the edge of a cliff. The drop was steep, disappearing into mist far below. I was trapped. Turning, I saw the creature emerge from the shadows of the forest. In the pale moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its body was a twisted amalgamation of man and tree, bark-like skin stretched over an all-too-human frame, but its eyes were unmistakably those of a man filled with an agonizing mix of rage and sorrow. "Jeremiah," I called out in a voice that was shaking. "Jeremiah Blackwood?" The creature paused, tilting its head as if confused. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes. "I read your journal," I continued, hoping to reach whatever humanity might be left inside the monstrous form. "I knew what happened to you. Please, I'm not here to harm you or the forest." The creature let out another mournful cry, but it didn't advance. Instead, it sank to its knees, clutching its head as if in pain. I watched in horrified fascination as its form seemed to ripple and shift, features becoming more human for brief moments before twisting back into the monstrous visage. In that moment, I understood. Jeremiah wasn't fully gone. He was trapped, caught between human and creature, unable to fully become either. The forest hadn't simply changed him, it had merged with him, turning him into a guardian of sorts, but at a terrible cost. As dawn began to break, casting the forest in a soft, ethereal light, I made a decision. I couldn't leave Jeremiah like this. I had to find a way to help him, to free him from this half-existence. With newfound determination, I began to formulate a plan. The journal had mentioned symbols of protection. Perhaps there was a way to reverse the process, to separate Jeremiah from the forest entity that had consumed him. I approached the creature slowly, my hands raised to show I meant no harm. "Jeremiah," I said softly, "I want to help you. Can you understand me?" The creature, Jeremiah, let out a low groan but didn't move. I took that as a good sign and continued to speak, telling him about my own life, my reasons for coming to the forest. As I talked, I noticed the tension in its massive frame begin to ease. Encouraged, I pressed on. "Your journal, Jeremiah, the symbols you carved, they were meant to protect you, right? Or what if they did more than that? What if they're the key to freeing you?" At the mention of the symbols, Jeremiah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with what I could only describe as hope. She let out a series of grunts and growls that, while unintelligible, seemed to convey urgency. Taking a deep breath, I made a suggestion that I knew was risky. "We need to go back to the cabin, Jeremiah. The answers we need might be there." To my surprise, Jeremiah nodded. He rose to his feet and gestured for me to follow, lumbering off into the forest with surprising grace for his size. I hurried after him, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. The journey back to the cabin was surreal. Here I was, following a creature that was part man, part tree, through a forest that seemed alive with whispers and shadows. Yet, for the first time since I'd entered these woods, I felt a glimmer of hope. When we reached the cabin, Jeremiah hung back, seemingly unable or unwilling to enter with us. I went inside, my eyes immediately drawn to the symbols carved into the walls. In the early morning light, filtering through the cracks, they seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I pulled out the journal and began to study it intensely, looking for any clue that might help. Hours passed as I pored over Jeremiah's frantic scribblings, trying to decipher the meaning behind the symbols. As the sun began to set once more, I finally found something promising. A series of symbols different from the others, accompanied by a cryptic note. "The key to unmaking is in the remaking, blood freely given under the full moon's light." I rushed outside to share my discovery with Jeremiah. As I explained what I'd found, I could see understanding dawn in his two human eyes. He pointed urgently at the sky, where the full moon was just beginning to rise. We had one chance, tonight. As darkness fell, Jeremiah led me deeper into the forests to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a circle of ancient standing stones, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen. The air here felt different, charged as if with electricity. Jeremiah took up position in the center of the circle while I stood at the edge, journal in hand. The full moon rose higher, bathing the clearing in silvery light. It was time. With shaking hands, I began tracing the symbols from the journal onto the forest floor, using a mixture of dirt and my own blood freely given, as the journal had specified. As I worked, I could feel the energy in the clearing building, the air becoming thick and heavy. Jeremiah began to emit a low, keening sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The symbols on the ground started to glow with an eerie blue light, pulsing in time with Jeremiah's cries. Suddenly the wind picked up, swirling around the circle with increasing speed. Leaves and debris were caught in the vortex, obscuring my view of Jeremiah. His cries grew louder, more agonized, and I fought the urge to run to him. I knew instinctively that interrupting now could be disastrous. The maelstrom continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind died, the leaves settled, and silence descended on the clearing. As the dust cleared, I saw a figure lying motionless in the center of the circle. My heart racing, I approached cautiously. There on the ground was a man, human, naked and unconscious, but undeniably human. Jeremiah Blackwood had returned. The next few days passed in a blur. I managed to get Jeremiah back to the cabin, where he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, his eyes were clear and lucid, but he couldn't speak, whether from physical inability or the trauma of his experience. I couldn't tell. I used my satellite phone, which mysteriously began working again, to call for help. The story we gave to the authorities was simple. Two hikers, lost in the woods for days, one suffering from exposure and dehydration. It wasn't the whole truth, but who would have believed us if we told them? As we waited for rescue, I showed Jeremiah his journal. He read it with a mix of fascination and horror, as if seeing the words of a stranger.
Perhaps in a way he was.
When the rescue team finally arrived, they were shocked by our condition, but relieved to find us alive. They had been searching for days, they told us, ever since they found my abandoned campsite. As we were airlifted out of the forest, I looked down at the vast expanse of green below us. From up here, it looked peaceful, benign. But I knew the truth now. I knew the power and the danger that lurked beneath those branches. Jeremiah and I were taken to a hospital where we were treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and various cuts and bruises. The doctors were baffled by Jeremiah's condition, unable to explain the strange bark-like patches on his skin or the leaves that seemed to sprout from his hair. In the weeks that followed, as we recovered and tried to adjust to normal life, Jeremiah slowly began to speak again. He told me of his years in the forest, of the gradual merging with the ancient spirit that dwelled there. He spoke of the loneliness, the fear, but also of the incredible connection he had felt to the natural world. It wasn't all bad, he said one day, his voice still rough from disuse. There was a beauty to it, a purpose. But it wasn't living, not really. Thank you, Warren, for bringing me back. As for me, I found that I couldn't simply return to my old life. The experience had changed me profoundly. I resigned from my job in the city and applied for a position as a forest ranger. I needed to be close to the woods to keep an eye on things, to make sure no one else stumbled into the ancient power that still dwelled there. Jeremiah decided to stay as well. The forest is still a part of me, he explained. I can feel it calling to me. But now, I can choose how to answer that call. Together we became guardians of a different sort. We patrolled the forest, guided hikers, and kept the secrets of the deep woods safe. And on following nights when the air thrummed with ancient power, we would sit in silence at the edge of the forest, listening to the whispers of the trees, and remembering the thin line that separates the world we know from the one we don't. The experience had taught us both a valuable lesson. Nature is not something to be conquered or controlled, but respected and protected. The forest had its own consciousness, its own will, and we had been granted a rare glimpse into its true nature. As I stand here now, years later, looking out over the vast expanse of Gifford Pinchot National Forest, I can't help but feel a mix of awe and trepidation. The forest seems quieter these days, more peaceful, but I know the power still lurks beneath the surface, waiting. And so we watch and we wait, Jeremiah and I, guardians of the secret heart of the forest, keepers of a truth too vast and strange for the outside world to comprehend. The forest changed us, marked us, and in doing so gave us a purpose greater than we could have ever imagined. In the end, I realized that the old man at the trailhead had been right. The forest does have a way of changing a person, but whether that changes for better or worse, that's up to us. The name is Thomas Garcia, but the events I am about to recount happened to me on October 5th. It's a story that has haunted me for over 3 decades, one that I've rarely shared due to fear of disbelief or ridicule. But as I approach the twilight of my life, I feel compelled to put it down in writing to leave a record of what I experienced in those fateful days in the Pinalino Mountains of Arizona. Back then I was a different man, younger of course, but also more carefree and adventurous. I worked as a middle manager at a paper company in Phoenix, a job that paid the bills but did little to satisfy my wanderlust, to combat the monotony of my 9-to-5 existence. I developed a passion for solo camping trips. There was something about the solitude of nature that rejuvenated my spirit in a way nothing else could. My vehicle of choice for these excursions was an old Winnebago, a beat-up 78 model I'd bought secondhand a few years back. There wasn't much to look at with its faded beige exterior and the occasional rust spot, but it was my ticket to freedom. I'd lovingly restored much of the interior, replacing the worn-out upholstery and fixing up the kitchenette. It wasn't fancy, but it was home away from home. For months I'd been planning this particular trip to the Pinalino Mountain. It's a beautiful spot, not too popular with tourists, which is just how I like it. I'd saved up my vacation days, squirreling them away like a miser hoarding gold coins. By the time October rolled around, I had a full week to spend in the wilderness. My preparations were meticulous. I stocked up on canned goods, filled a cooler with enough beer to last the week and then some, and packed a stack of old paperback novels, mostly westerns and mystery thrillers. I made sure my first aid kit was fully stocked and double-checked all my camping gear. I even splodged on a new sleeping bag, anticipating the chilly autumn nights in the mountains. Originally, my buddy Carl Benton was supposed to join me. We've been friends since high school, and he shared my love for the outdoors. We did countless camping trips together over the years, swapping stories around the campfire and solving the world's problems over cans of cheap beer. But a week before we were set to leave, Carl called with the news that his wife Linda was expecting their first child. She was having a difficult pregnancy, and Carl, understandably, didn't want to leave her alone. "I'm sorry, Tom," he said over the phone, his voice a mixture of excitement and regret. "You know I'd be there if I could, but don't sweat it, Carl," I replied, trying to hide my disappointment. "Family comes first. We'll catch the next one together." So, on the morning of October 12th, 1992, I set out alone in my trusty Winnebago. The drive from Phoenix to the Pinalino Mountains took about 4 hours, but I was in no rush. I took my time enjoying the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to desert, and eventually to the pine-covered foothills of the mountain. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached my destination, a secluded campsite I'd discovered on a previous trip. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a bubbling creek nearby. I parked the Winnebago, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, and felt the stress of city life begin to melt away. That first evening, as I sat by my campfire nursing a cold beer, I had no idea of the terror that awaited me in the days to come. If I had known, would I have turned back? Would I have fled to the safety of civilization? I like to think that the man I was then wouldn't have faced the unknown with courage. But the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is that the events that unfolded in that quiet mountain clearing would change me forever, leaving me with questions that have haunted me for over 30 years. The first couple of days of my camping trip were nothing short of idyllic. I fell into a comfortable routine, waking with the sun, brewing a pot of strong coffee over the campfire, and spending my mornings exploring the surrounding wilderness. The Pinalino Mountains in autumn were a feast for the senses. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. The trees were ablaze with red and gold leaves, and the only sounds were the rustling of wind through the branches and the occasional call of a bird. I'd spend hours hiking the mountain trails, my trusty Nikon camera around my neck, capturing the beauty of my surroundings. Sometimes I'd bring along my fishing rod and try my luck in the creek that ran near my campsite. I wasn't much of an angler, but I managed to catch a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cooked over the fire, savoring the taste of my own little victory against nature. In the evenings, I'd settle into my folding chair by the fire, a beer in one hand and a dog-eared Louis L'Amour novel in the other. As darkness fell and the stars came out, I'd look up at the vast expanse of the night sky, marveling at the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. It was in moments like these that I felt truly at peace, connected to something larger than myself. But on the third night, October 15th, things started to change. I remembered the date clearly because it was the anniversary of my father's death, and I'd spent some time that evening reminiscing about him, wishing he could have seen this beautiful place. I was sitting by the fire, parking at the embers with a stick, lost in thought when I heard something rustling in the bushes behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The woods were full of life after all, and I'd seen plenty of deer and raccoons during my hikes. But there was something about the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was too deliberate, too heavy to be a small animal. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the underbrush. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back to the fire, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large had darted behind a tree just at the edge of my vision. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the night. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the soft crackle of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight into the woods. The shadows seemed to dance and shift in the unsteady light, but I saw nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's what I heard." After a few minutes of peering into the darkness, I returned to my chair, feeling foolish. "You're letting your imagination run wild, old man," I muttered to myself, taking a long swig of beer. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned on early that night, locking myself in the Winnebago and drawing all the curtain. It took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were troubled, filled with shapeless shadows and the sound of heavy footsteps. The next morning, I woke to a beautiful, crisp autumn day. The events of the night before seemed silly in the bright light of day, and I chided myself for getting spooked over nothing. But as I stepped out of the RV, stretching and breathing in the cool mountain air, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints, but these were like no footprints I'd ever seen before. They were large, much too big for a person, with almost finger-like toes. The first thought was that it must be a bear, but I'd seen bear tracks before, and these were different. The shape was all wrong, more elongated, almost human-like, but grotesquely distorted. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and there to flee back to the safety of civilization. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to adventure and mystery, was intrigued. What could have made these tracks? What kind of creature was out there in the woods? In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I took out my disposable camera and snapped several photos of the tracks, thinking they'd make for an interesting story to share with Carl when I got back. Then, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, I set out to explore the area, determined to find some explanation for what I'd seen. Little did I know I was taking the first steps down a path that would lead me into the heart of a mystery and a terror, beyond anything I could have imagined. As the day wore on, I found myself unable to shake the unease that had settled over me. The strange footprints I'd discovered that morning haunted my thoughts, their impossible shape defying any rational explanation. I tried to distract myself with my usual activities, hiking, reading, tending to my campsite, but my mind kept circling back to those tracks and the rustling I'd heard in the night. That evening, I decided to stay closer to the RV. I told myself it was because I was tired from my morning hike, but deep down I knew it was fear keeping me tethered to the relative safety of my campsite. I fired up the small propane grill I'd brought along and cooked some hot dogs, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. As I sat in my folding chair, attempting to lose myself in one of the Western novels I'd brought along, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then I'd hear a snap of a twig or the crunch of leaves from the surrounding woods. Each time I'd look up, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything out of the ordinary. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As darkness fell, I built up my campfire, taking comfort in its warmth and light. But as the night deepened, so did my sense of unease. The woods seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight I heard it again, the same rustling sound from the night before. This time it was louder and more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the circle of light cast by my fire. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam toward the source of the noise. For a split second, no more than the blink of an eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of two glowing eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any animal I knew of, and they seemed to shine with an unnatural, almost intelligent light. As quickly as I'd seen them, the eyes disappeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the pounding of my heart and the cold sweat on my brow told me it had been real. Whatever was out there in the woods, it was no ordinary animal. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, my hunting knife close at hand. I kept the fire burning high and bright, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Sleep was out of the question. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jumping. My eyes strained to penetrate the darkness beyond my little circle of light. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I made it through the night, but as the shadows retreated and I surveyed my campsite in the growing light, I saw something that made my heart sink. There, in the soft earth at the edge of the clearing, were more of those strange, elongated footprints. Whatever had been watching me in the night had come close, terrifyingly close. While I'd sat there blind and vulnerable in the firelight, I knew then that I couldn't stay. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up and leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I stood there staring at those impossible footprints, a different impulse took hold. I'd come here seeking adventure, hadn't I? And now, for better or worse, I'd found it. With a mixture of fear and determination, I made a decision. I wouldn't run, not yet. Instead, I would try to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path of discovery and terror that would change my life forever. After a sleepless night, I spent the morning debating my next move. Part of me, the rational, self-preserving part, was urging me to pack up and leave, to put this whole unsettling experience behind me. But there was another part, driven by a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride, that couldn't bear the thought of leaving without answers. In the end, curiosity won out. I decided to explore the area where I'd seen those glowing eyes the night before. I packed a day bag with water, some trail mix, my camera, and my hunting knife. As an afterthought, I also threw in a can of bear spray. I knew deep down that whatever was out there probably wasn't a bear, but the weight of the can in my pack was oddly comforting. I set out mid-morning when the autumn sun was climbing high in a clear blue sky. The woods were beautiful, the trees resplendent in their fall colors, but I found it hard to appreciate the scenery. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig had me on edge, my eyes constantly scanning the forest around me. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The ground was soft from recent rain, and those strange, elongated footprints were clearly visible. They led away from my campsite, deeper into the woods. With my heart racing and my throat tight, I began to follow them. For about an hour I tracked the footprints through the forest. They seemed to meander aimlessly at times, circling back on themselves or veering off in unexpected directions. But gradually I realized they were leading me up a gentle slope away from the creek and into a denser, older part of the forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted with age. The canopy above was so thick that little sunlight penetrated, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The air felt different here too, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Just as I was considering turning back, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. There, nestled in a small clearing, was an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. The windows were shattered, jagged shards of glass clinging to rotted frames. The door hung crookedly from rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I had come too far to back out now. I had to know what secrets this place held. The interior of the cabin was a scene of decay and abandonment. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the small animal tracks that crisscrossed the floor. What little furniture remained was broken and rotting. A collapsed table, the remnants of what might have been a chair, rusted metal bed frame. But it was the far wall that truly caught my attention. Carved into the wood were strange symbols unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They didn't resemble any alphabet or writing system I was familiar with. Instead, they seemed almost organic, twisting and intertwining in complex patterns that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. I pulled up my camera and began snapping pictures, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew it was important. These carvings, this cabin, were connected somehow to the creature I glimpsed in the night. I was sure of it. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden under a pile of moldy leaves and debris, was the edge of what looked like a trapdoor. My heart raced as I knelt down to clear away the detritus.
Sure enough, there it was.
A wooden trapdoor, its surface worn smooth by time and use. For a moment I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me of the dangers that could lie below. But my curiosity, that same driving force that had led me this far, wouldn't let me walk away. With trembling hands, I grasped the iron ring set into the wood and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness below. The musty smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, making me gag slightly. I shone my flashlight down, revealing a crude ladder descending into a small earthen chamber. I took a deep breath to steel myself. I began to climb down. The ladder creaked ominously under my weight, but held. As I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around, taking in my surroundings. The chamber was small, no more than 10 feet across. The walls were earthen, reinforced with old rotting timbers. But it was what was in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. There, occupying most of the floor space, was a large stone altar. Its surface was stained dark, and I didn't want to think too hard about what might have caused those stains. More of those strange symbols were carved into its sides, seeming to writhe and twist in the unsteady beam of my flashlight. On the walls, crude paintings depicted scenes that turned my stomach. They showed grotesque, misshapen figures engaged in what looked like ritual activities. And towering over these figures in each scene was a larger entity, its form indistinct but unmistakably menacing. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floor of the cabin above me. Panic seized me. I quickly switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into total darkness. I pressed myself against the earthen wall, hardly daring to breathe as I listened to the movements above. The footsteps crossed the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. I paused near the trapped door, and for a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it was about to open. But then they moved away, crossing back to the cabin door. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. When I was sure the coast was clear, I cautiously made my way back up the ladder, my every movement painfully slow and quiet. The cabin was empty when I emerged, but I didn't linger. I ran faster than I'd ever run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that accursed cabin as possible. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was setting. I was scratched, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but I didn't stop to rest. I threw my belongings haphazardly into the Winnebago, not caring about organization or damage. Within minutes, I was on the road, driving perhaps a bit too fast down the winding mountain paths. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Phoenix, hours later, that I finally allowed myself to relax. As the familiar lights of the city came into view, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe. I had escaped. But as I drove through the quiet suburban streets towards my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The things I'd seen, the mysteries I'd uncovered, they wouldn't simply disappear because I'd left them behind in those mountains. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that someday I would have to return. Someday I would have to face the truth about what lurked in the shadows of the Pinalena Mountain. The entity I'd come to think of as the Hightail, a name that came to me in my nightmares during the weeks that followed, wasn't finished with me yet. As I pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, I made a silent vow. I would prepare, research, and when the time came, I would be ready to uncover the full truth of the Hightail no matter the cost. Little did I know then how high that cost would be, or how deeply the mystery of the Hightail would come to define the rest of my life. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. It's been over 3 decades since that fateful camping trip, and not a single day goes by that I don't think about what happened in those woods. I've spent years researching, trying to find any information about the strange symbols I saw or the creature I glimpsed. I've reached out to historians, anthropologists, even paranormal investigators, but answers remain elusive. I did go back to the Pinalena Mountains several times over the years, but I never found that cabin again. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, taking its secrets with it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by fear and isolation. But then I look at the photos I took, the footprints, the symbols on the cabin wall, and I know it was real. I've heard whispers over the years, stories of other encounters in those mountains, hikers gone missing, strange sightings reported by campers, but nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, there, that proves what I As I sit here now, an old man nearing the end of his days, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever know the truth. Where was the hightail? Where did it come from? And why did it let me go that night when it could have easily caught me? These questions haunt me still, but I take comfort in knowing that by sharing my story, I might inspire others to look deeper, to question the world around them. Because if there's one thing I've learned in all these years, it's that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we could ever imagine. And somewhere out there in the deep, dark woods of the Petalino Mountains, something is waiting, watching, biding its time. The hightail, or whatever it truly is still out there. And someday, someone will uncover the truth. Really hope they're more prepared for what they find than I was. This is Thomas Garcia signing off. Remember, the truth is out there. You just have to be brave enough or foolish enough to look for it. My name is Michael Martinez. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on July 14th, 2003. But its repercussions have echoed through the years, haunting me to this day. I've always loved camping ever since I was a kid growing up in the suburbs of Denver. There's something about the quiet of the wilderness, the crackle of a campfire, and the stars overhead that just feels right. It's a connection to nature that I've cherished all my life. So when I finally retired from my job as a high school history teacher and bought myself a modest RV, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I've been saving up for years, dreaming of the day when I could hit the open road and explore the great outdoors at my own pace. The RV wasn't anything fancy, a 2000 Winnebago Adventurer 35 feet long with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and enough space for me and a friend or two. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I decided to take it out for a week-long trip to a spot I'd found while researching online. A secluded area near the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. It was about a 6-hour drive from my home in Denver, but I figured it would be worth it for the solitude and natural beauty. I didn't want to go alone though. As much as I loved the idea of solo camping at my age, it seemed wise to have someone along just in case. That's when I thought of my old friend Dave Whitman, who had been thick as thieves back in college. Roommates all 4 years at the University of Colorado. After graduation, life had taken us in different directions, me into teaching, him into accounting. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but it had been a good 5 years since we'd last seen each other face to face. I gave Dave a call on a whim, not really expecting him to be free or interested. To my surprise and delight, he jumped at the chance. "Mike, old buddy," he'd exclaimed over the phone, his voice warm with nostalgia. "A camping trip in an RV? Hell yes, I'm in. When do we leave?" We set the date for July 14th, Monday. I figured leaving early in the week would mean fewer crowds at the campsite. The night before our departure, I barely slept. It wasn't just excitement keeping me up. There was a strange sense of anticipation, almost foreboding, that I couldn't quite shake. I chalked it up to pre-trip jitters and the natural anxiety that comes with age. The morning of the 14th dawned clear and bright. I was up before the sun, double-checking my supplies and making sure the RV was in good shape. I had stocked up on all the essentials, plenty of food, water, first aid supplies, and of course beer. Can't go camping without beer, after all. Dave arrived at my place around 5 a.m. Right on time. He looked good for 69, a little heavier than in our college days. His hair more salt than pepper, but his eyes still had that mischievous twinkle I remembered so well. "Ready for an adventure, Mikey?" He grinned, using the old nickname from our university days. I laughed, feeling some of my anxiety melt away. "You bet, Davy boy. Hop in. We've got a long drive ahead of us." As we pulled out of my driveway, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn. The streets of Denver were quiet. Most of the city still asleep. It felt like we were embarking on a secret mission, sneaking away while the world slumbered. The drive was pleasant, filled with catching up and reminiscing. Dave told me about his grandkids, showing me pictures on his flip phone. I found him in all my life since retirement, the volunteer work I'd been doing at the local library the garden had started. It was comfortable, easy, like no time had passed at all. As we crossed into Wyoming, the landscape changed. The rolling plains gave way to more rugged terrain, hinting at the mountains to come. We stopped for lunch at a small diner in Casper, splitting a plate of biscuits and gravy that was so good it nearly brought tears to our eyes. Just like Mom used to make, Dave said, patting his stomach contentedly. It was mid-afternoon when we finally reached our destination. The turnoff from the main road was easy to miss, just a small dirt track leading into the trees. I navigated the RV carefully, mindful of the uneven ground and low-hanging branches. After about a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing next to a burbling creek. It was perfect, secluded, beautiful, with plenty of flat ground for the RV and our campsite. "Will you look at that?" Dave whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The creek sparkled invitingly, and in the distance we could see the peaks of mountains rising against the sky. We set about making camp, falling into an easy rhythm. Dave set up the awning and outdoor furniture while I got the inside of the RV sorted. By the time the sun was setting, we had a cozy little setup, 2 camp chairs by a freshly dug fire pit, the RV providing a comforting presence at our backs. As night fell, we sat by the fire, cracking open our first beers of the trip. The stars came out more than I'd seen in years. Away from the city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. 2 old friends and new adventures, Dave said, raising his beer in a toast. I clinked my can against his, smiling. 2 old friends and new adventures. We sat in companionable silence for a while, just enjoying the night and each other's company. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing up into the dark. In the distance, an owl hooted softly. "You know," Dave said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I'm glad you called me, Mike. I needed this, getting away from it all." I looked over at him, noting the lines of stress around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Everything okay, Dave?" he sighed, taking a long pull from his beer before answering. You know how it is. Work's been stressful. The firm's talking about downsizing, and at my age, well, let's just say I'm not feeling too secure." I nodded sympathetically. Even though I was retired, I remembered all too well the stress of work, the constant worry about job security. "I'm sorry to hear that, Dave. Is there anything I can do?" He shook his head, smiling ruefully. "No, but thanks for asking. Just being out here, away from it all, it helps, puts things in perspective." We lapsed back into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As I stared into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our little circle of light. I told myself it was just my imagination, the natural weariness that comes with being in an unfamiliar place. If only I had known then what I know now. If only I had listened to that little voice of warning in the back of my mind, but I didn't. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to too many horror movies and an overactive imagination. As we doused the fire and headed into the RV for the night, I had no idea that our peaceful camping trip was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The horrors that awaited us in the coming days would change our lives forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. But for that night at least, we slept peacefully, lulled by the sound of the creek and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. It was the last truly restful night we would have for a long time. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke early, as I often do these days. The habits of a lifetime of early rising for work are hard to break, even in retirement. I lay on my bunk for a while, listening to Dave's soft snores from the other end of the RV and the cheerful songs of birds outside. Eventually I got up, careful not to wake Dave. I put on a pot of coffee and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The clearing looked different in the early light, softer somehow, draped in tendrils of mist that rose from the creek. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of our campsite where the clearing met the dense forest, several branches had been broken off a small tree. They hung at odd angles, their leaves already beginning to wilt. I frowned, moving closer to investigate. The breaks didn't look like the work of any animal I knew. They were too high up for a deer and too clean for a bear. It almost looked as if someone had deliberately snapped them off, but who would do that and why? A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, my heart suddenly racing. But it was just Dave stumbling out of the RV with a murmured good morning and making a beeline for the coffee pot. I hesitated, then decided not to mention the broken branches. No need to worry Dave over what was probably nothing. Still, as we went about our morning routine, breakfast, cleaning up, planning our day, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We spent the day exploring the area around our campsite. It was a nice hiking trail that followed the creek upstream, winding through the forest and offering beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. Dave was in his element, pointing out various plants and birds, his earlier stress seeming to melt away in the face of nature's beauty. As we hiked, I found myself scanning the trees looking for, well, I wasn't sure what, more broken branches, signs of large animals. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling from the morning persisted, sitting in the pit of my stomach like a stone. We returned to the campsite late in the afternoon, tired but happy. Dave insisted on cooking dinner. He brought along some steaks he wanted to grill over the campfire. As the smell of cooking meat filled the air, I found myself relaxing. The unease of the morning seemed distant and silly in the face of good food and good company. After dinner, we sat by the fire again, nursing our beers and swapping old stories. The night was peaceful, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle burble of the creek. Then suddenly a noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, a rustling in the underbrush, barely audible over the fire, but it grew louder closer. It sounded like something large moving through the trees, just beyond the ring of firelight. Dave broke off mid-sentence, his eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my earlier unease rushing back full force. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Probably just a deer or something." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The noise was too loud, too deliberate for a deer. Whatever was out there, it was big. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears. The rustling continued for a few more moments, then abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. "Maybe we should head in for the night," Dave suggested, his voice shaky. I agreed, and we quickly doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the RV. As I locked the door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, I dreamed of dark shapes moving through the trees, of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I woke several times, sweating and disoriented, only to be lulled back to sleep by Dave's steady breathing in the familiar confines of the RV. When morning came again, I was exhausted. Dave didn't look much better. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with the slow caution of someone nursing a hangover. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded, rubbing his face. "Yeah, I've had some weird dreams. I hesitated, then nodded. "Same here, must be something in the air out here." We went about our morning routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Both of us jumped at small noises, and I caught Dave scanning the tree line more than once, a worried frown on his face. As we were cleaning up after breakfast, Dave suddenly grabbed my arm. "Mike," he said, his voice low and urgent, "look at the RV." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There on the side of the RV were long, deep scratches. They ran from near the ground all the way up to the windows, as if something huge had raked its claws down the side of the vehicle. "What the hell?" I muttered, moving closer to inspect the damage. The scratches were deep, gouging through the paint and the metal beneath. Whatever had made them was powerful. "We need to leave," Dave said, his voice shaking. "No." Part of me wanted to agree to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as we could. But another part, the part that had faced down unruly teenagers for decades, rebelled at the idea of being scared away from our vacation. "Let's not overreact," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. It was probably just a bear attracted by the smell of our dinner last night. We'll be more careful about food storage, and Emma leave us alone. Dave didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "Okay," he said. "But if anything else happens, we're out of here." "Deal?" "Deal," I agreed. We spent the rest of the day close to camp, neither of us willing to venture too far into the woods. We fished in the creek, played cards, and tried to pretend everything was normal. We both kept glancing at the woods, jumping at every unexpected sound. As night fell, we decided to forgo the campfire. Instead, we sat in the RV, playing cards by the light of the battery-powered lantern. Outside, the woods seemed to press closer, the darkness feeling almost alive. We were in the middle of a hand of gin rummy when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from right outside the RV. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human. Dave's cards fell from his suddenly nervous fingers. "Mike," he whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "What the hell is that?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. The growl came again, louder this time, and something bumped against the side of the RV, making the whole vehicle rock slightly. We sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The bumping continued, moving around the RV as if whatever it was circling us. Then abruptly it stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then, from right outside the window came a sound that chilled me to my very core, a deep, rumbling laugh that sounded almost but not quite human. Dave and I looked at each other, our faces mirrors of terror. Whatever was out there, we both knew one thing for certain. It wasn't a bear. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. Dave and I sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The battery-powered lantern cast long shadows across the interior of the RV, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. "What do we do?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to start the RV and drive away as fast as we could. Another part, which had faced down unruly students and angry parents over the years, rebelled at the idea of running away from an unseen threat. "We wait," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever it is, it can get in here. We're safe as long as we stay inside." Dave nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that the thin walls of the RV weren't much protection if whatever was out there really wanted to get in. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sound of movement outside. Occasionally we hear a twig snap or a leaves rustle, sending fresh waves of fear through us. But the laughter didn't come again, nor did the growling or the bumping against the RV. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, we finally allowed ourselves to relax slightly. Dave had dozed off in his chair, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle. I envied him his ability to sleep even in these circumstances, so I had remained awake all night. My eyes fixed on the door, my hands clenched around a heavy flashlight I had grabbed as a makeshift weapon. When the sun had fully risen, I gently shook Dave awake. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's check outside." Dave blinked awake, confusion giving way to remembrance and then fear as the events of the night came back to him. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I wasn't sure at all, but I knew we couldn't stay in the RV forever. "We'll be careful, I promised. Just a quick look around." Slowly, cautiously, we opened the RV door and stepped outside. The morning was beautiful, crisp and clear, with no sign of the terror we had experienced during the night. Birds were singing, the creek was burbling peacefully, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. But as we walked around the RV, we saw evidence that last night hadn't been a dream or a shared hallucination. There were deep impressions in the soft ground around the RV. Huge, misshapen footprints that looked almost, but not quite, human. And on the side of the RV, in addition to the scratches we had noticed before, there was now a smear of some dark, foul-smelling substance. Dave leaned in to examine it, then recoiled quickly. "God, what is that?" he gagged. I shook my head, fighting back my own wave of nausea. "I don't know, I don't want to know. We need to leave, Dave, now." This time there was no argument. We quickly packed up our campsite, our earlier careful organization replaced by a frantic need to get away as quickly as possible. Within an hour, we were on the road, the RV bouncing along the dirt track that led back to the main highway. As we drove, Dave and I discussed what to do next. We both agreed that we needed to report what had happened, but we were less certain about who to tell. The police, the Forest Service, would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to stop at the ranger station near the entrance to Shoshone National Forest. The ranger on duty, a weathered-looking man in his 50s named John Hawkins, listened to our story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes flickering between Dave and me as if trying to gauge our sincerity. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You boys aren't the first to come in here with a story like that," he said quietly. Dave and I exchanged surprised glances. "You mean this has happened before?" I asked. Ranger Hawkins nodded slowly. "We get a few reports every year. Campers hearing strange noises, seeing footprints, that sort of thing. Most folks write it off as bears or mountain lions," but he trailed off, his gaze distant. "But what?" Dave pressed. The ranger seemed to shake himself out of his reverie. "But there are stories," he said. "Old stories passed down by the Shoshone people who lived in these parts long before us. They talk about a creature that lives in the deepest parts of the forest. Something that's not quite animal, not quite human." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the laughter we had heard. That terrible, almost human laugh. What do they call it? I asked. Not sure I wanted to know the answer. "The Shoshone have a name for it," Ranger Hawkins said. "But most folks around here just call it the Jaeger." "The Jaeger," Dave repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it supposed to be?" The ranger shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's a type of Bigfoot. Others think it's something older, something that was here long before humans came to these parts. All the stories agree on one thing, though. It's dangerous, cunning, and it doesn't like people in its territory." We left the ranger station with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease. Dave and I agreed to head back to Denver immediately, neither of us feeling up to continuing our camping trip after what we had experienced. The drive back was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the Jaeger, about those footprints and that terrible laughter. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, as the product of overactive imaginations and too many campfire stories. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and I knew that whatever was out there in the Shoshone National Forest, it was very, very real. We arrived back in Denver late that night. Dave and I said our goodbyes, promising to keep in touch. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, we spoke less and less. It was as if by not talking about what had happened, we could pretend it had never occurred at all. Life went on. I threw myself into my retirement activities, volunteering, gardening, the occasional substituting gig. But the memory of that night in the woods never fully left me. Sometimes late at night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that and human laughter ringing in my ears. 5 years passed. I had almost convinced myself that the whole incident had been some sort of shared delusion, a product of stress in an unfamiliar environment. Then one crisp-autumn morning, I received a call that would shatter that comforting illusion forever. It was Dave's wife, Susan. Her voice was thick with tears as she told me the news. Dave had gone missing during a solo camping trip in the Shoshone National Forest. As Susan spoke, describing how Dave had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his trip, how he had become obsessed with researching local legends and folklore, I felt a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I knew with a certainty that defied rational explanation that Dave had gone back to look for the Jaeger, and I knew with equal certainty that I had to go find him. The next day, I loaded up my old RV and set out for Wyoming. As I drove, memories of that night 5 years ago came flooding back. The scratches on the RV, the footprints in the mud, the terrible mocking laughter. But this time I wasn't going in unprepared. I had spent the night researching everything I could find about the Jaeger and the legends surrounding it. I had packed supplies, weapons, and every piece of camping and survival gear I owned. As I crossed the state line into Wyoming, I glanced at myself in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at me was older, more lined, but set with a determination I hadn't felt in years. "I'm coming, Dave," I muttered to myself. "This time we're gonna get answers." Little did I know that the answers I sought would be far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The creature that waited for me in the depths of the Shoshone National Forest was more than just a legend, more than just a monster. It was something ancient, something primal, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to come looking for it. As I drove deeper into Wyoming, the sun setting behind me and the forest looming ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards my destiny. Whether that destiny would bring salvation or doom, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the Jaeger was waiting. And this time, there would be no escape. The familiar landscape of Wyoming rolled by outside my RV window, but this time, the beauty of the rugged terrain was lost on me. My mind was consumed with worry for Dave and apprehension about what lay ahead. I had called Susan before leaving Denver, promising her that I would do everything in my power to find Dave. She had given me what little information she had and the name of the campground where Dave had last been seen. The date he was supposed to return. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. As I neared the turnoff for Shoshone National Forest, I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The memories of our last trip here were still vivid, despite the years that had passed. I could almost hear that inhuman laughter echoing in my ears. I pulled into the ranger station, hoping to speak with Ranger Hawkins again, but the man behind the desk was younger, probably in his early 30s. His name tag read, Mark Thompson. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely as I approached. I explained the situation as best I could, trying to strike a balance between urgency and not sounding like a complete lunatic. To his credit, Ranger Thompson listened attentively, his brow furrowing with concern. "We did have a report of a missing camper," he said when I finished. "David Whitman. Is that your friend?" I nodded, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. Relief that Dave's disappearance had been noted, dread at the confirmation that he was indeed missing. Ranger Thompson pulled out a map of the forest, spreading it out on the desk between us. "Mr. Whitman's car was found here," he said, pointing to a spot near a campground. "We've had search parties out every day, but so far we haven't found any sign of him." I leaned in, studying the map. The campground was close to where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. Too close to be a coincidence, I was sure. I'd like to join the search, I said. Ranger Thompson looked at me doubtfully. Sir, I appreciate your concern for your friend, but our search and rescue teams are trained professionals. It might be better if you left this to them. I shook my head firmly. I'm going out there with or without your blessing. I know these woods, and I know Dave. I might see something your teams would miss. The ranger sighed, recognizing the determination in my voice. All right, he said reluctantly. But please be careful. These woods can be dangerous, especially if you're not prepared. If only he knew how dangerous, I thought grimly. I spent the rest of the day preparing for my search. I stocked up on supplies, studied the map Ranger Thompson had given me, and tried to recall everything I could about our previous trip and the legend of the Jaeger. As night fell, I parked my RV at the campground where Dave's car had been found. The place was quiet, most of the other campers having left to do the search activity. I was grateful for the solitude. It would make it easier for me to conduct my own investigation without raising suspicion. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound from the forest outside set my nerves on edge. Was it just the wind in the trees or something more sinister? As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When dawn finally broke, I was already up and ready to go. I packed a day bag with water, food, a first aid kit, and other essentials. After a moment's hesitation, I also included the old revolver I had brought with me. I wasn't sure it would be much use against the Jaeger if the legends were true, but its weight was reassuring nonetheless. I set out just as the sun was cresting the horizon, the forest around me still shrouded in early morning mist. I had a general idea of where I wanted to go, the area where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It was a hunch, but it was all I had to go on. As I hiked, I kept my senses alert for any sign of Dave or anything unusual. The forest seemed peaceful, almost eerily so. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been walking for several hours when I found the first sign that I was on the right track. There, half hidden by a bush, was a scrap of fabric. I recognized it immediately. It was from the jacket Dave had been wearing in the photo Susan had shown me. My heart pounding, I pushed deeper into the forest. The terrain was becoming rougher, the trees growing closer together. I was pretty sure I had left the marked trails behind some time ago. Then, as I rounded a large boulder, I saw it. The clearing where Dave and I had camped 5 years ago. It looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, but there was no mistaking it. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a tent. Dave's tent. I approached cautiously, calling out Dave's name, but there was no response. The clearing was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The tent was empty, but it showed signs of a struggle. The fabric was torn in several places, and Dave's sleeping bag was half pulled out of the entrance, as if he had been dragged from the tent. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, a twig snapped up behind me. I whirled around, my head going to the revolver at my hip. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. For a moment, I thought it was Dave. But as my eyes focused, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was something else entirely. It was tall, far taller than any man. Its body covered in matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence, and its mouth was stretched in a terrible mocking grin. The Jago, it was real, and it was here as I stood frozen in shock and fear. The creature threw back its head and laughed, that same chilling laugh I had heard 5 years ago. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the forest. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But eventually, I managed to shake off my paralysis. I knew I should leave, should run back to the ranger station and report what I had seen, but Dave was still out there somewhere, and now I knew for certain what had taken him. With shaking hands, I checked my revolver, making sure it was loaded. Then, taking a deep breath to steady myself, I plunged into the forest after the Gagga. I was no longer just searching for my friend. I was hunting a monster, and I had a terrible feeling that it was hunting me too. The forest seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into its depths, following the path the Jagger had taken. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decaying leaves and something else, something rank and animal. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the eerie silence. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, my hand never straying far from the revolver at my hip. The weight of the gun was reassuring, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wondered if it would be any use against a creature like the Jagger. Tongue seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed on. The forest looked the same, endless trees, patches of undergrowth, the occasional boulder or fallen log. I began to fear that I was walking in circles, that I would never find my way out again. Then, just as despair was beginning to set in, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, impaled on a broken branch at about eye level, was a scrap of cloth. As I moved closer, my heart sinking, I recognized it as a piece of Dave's shirt. It was stained dark with what could only be blood. Fighting back a wave of nausea, I forced myself to examine the area more closely. There were other signs of disturbance, broken branches, scuff marks in the dirt, more drops of blood. It looked like something large had been dragged through here. With a grim determination, I continued to follow the trail. The signs of passage became more pronounced. Deep gouges in the tree trunks, tufts of coarse hair caught on thorny bushes, and an increasingly strong musky odor that made my nose wrinkle in disgust. As I pressed on, the forest began to change. The trees grew more twisted and misshapen, their bark was blackened as if by some ancient fire. The ground beneath my feet became soggy and treacherous, each step accompanied by a sickening squelch. I realized I was entering a swampy area, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps I had studied. The light was fading fast now, twilight settled over the forest like a shroud. I knew I should turn back, that continuing on in the growing darkness was madness, but the thought of Dave alone and at the mercy of that creature spurred me onward. It was then that I heard it, a low, keening wail that echoed through the trees. It was a sound of pain, of desperation, and it was unmistakably human. "Dave," I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "Dave, where are you?" The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then from somewhere ahead of me, I heard a weak voice call out, "Mike, is that you?" "Oh God, Mike, help me." It was Dave. He was alive. I surged forward, my fatigue forgotten in a rush of adrenaline. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. All that mattered was reaching Dave. I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing in the dim light. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, a sort of nest made from broken branches and what looked horribly like human bones. And there, half buried in the debris, was Dave. He looked terrible. His clothes were in tatters, his body covered in cuts and bruises. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. But he was alive. As he saw me, his eyes lit up with a desperate hope. "Mike," he gasped. "You came. You actually came." I rushed to his side, my hand shaking as I began to pull away the branches covering him. "Of course I came," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I couldn't leave you out here. Come on, we need to get you out of here before..." A low, rumbling growl cut me off mid-sentence. I froze, then slowly turned around. There at the edge of the clearing stood the Jaeger. In the fading light, it seemed even more monstrous than before. Its massive body was covered in matted fur, caked with mud, and what I prayed wasn't blood. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and yellowed pointed teeth. And its eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an eerie intelligence, filled with a malevolence that was all too human. For a long moment we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, the Jaeger charged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I drew my revolver and fired, the sound of the shots deafening in the enclosed space of the clearing. The Jaeger staggered, dark blood blossoming on its chest. But it didn't go down. If anything, the wounds only seemed to enrage it further. With a speed that belied its size, the creature closed the distance between us. I managed to squeeze off one more shot before it was upon me, its massive paw swatting the gun from my hand as if it were a toy. The impact sent me sprawling, and I tasted blood as my head struck the ground. Through a haze of pain, I saw the Jaeger looming over me, its foul breath hot on my face as it prepared to deliver the killing blow. In that moment, facing what I was sure was my death, a strange calm settled over me. I thought of my life, of the people I loved, of Dave lying injured just a few feet away, and I knew I couldn't give up. With a yell that surprised even me, I surged upward, driving my fist into the Jaeger's throat. It was like punching a brick wall, but the creature reared back, momentarily stunned. It was all the opening I needed. I scrambled to my feet and lunged for my fallen revolver. My fingers closed around the grip just as the Jaeger recovered and charged again. I reeled onto my back, brought the gun up, and emptied the remaining chambers into the creature's face. The Jaeger's roar of rage turned into a shriek of pain. It thrashed wildly, its massive body convulsing as it fought against the bullets tearing through its skull. And with a final earth-shaking bellow, it collapsed. For several long moments I lay there, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The clearing was silent, save for my ragged breathing and Dave's quiet whimpers of pain. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. The Jaeger lay motionless, dark blood pooling beneath its massive head. I approached cautiously, the gun still trained on its body, but there was no need. The creature was dead. I turned back to Dave, my hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. "It's over," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "It's really over." The next few hours passed in a blur. Somehow I managed to get Dave free from the nest and support him as we made our slow, painful way back through the forest. It was far dark by the time we reached the edge of the woods, but there were lights ahead, flashlights bobbing in the darkness. The search party found us just as Dave's strength gave out. I remember collapsing to my knees, still holding on to my friend as voices shouted and hands reached out to help us. The aftermath was a whirlwind of hospitals, police interviews, and media attention. Dave's story of abduction by an unknown creature made headlines, but without any concrete evidence, the Jaeger's body had vanished by the time a search team made it back to the clearing. It was eventually written off as the delusions of a man who had suffered a traumatic experience. As for me, I told a carefully edited version of events, leaving out any mention of the Jaeger. Who would have believed me anyway? In time, the furor died down and life began to return to normal. But I knew the truth. I had seen the Jaeger with my own eyes, felt its hot breath on my face, watched it die. And sometimes late at night I find myself wondering, was it really the only one of its kind? Or are there more creatures out there hiding in the dark places of the world, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain? I don't go camping anymore. The call of the wild has lost its appeal for me, but every now and then I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving where no shadow should be, a flash of glowing eyes in the darkness. And I will remember that night in the Shoshone National Forest, and the monster I faced there. The Jaeger may be gone, but its memory lives on. In the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, who knows what other secrets are waiting to be discovered. As I sit here, an old man now, recounting this story, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The world is a mysterious place, full of wonders and terrors beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, those terrors have teeth and claws and a laugh that echoes through the night, calling to something primitive and fearful deep within us all. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear a twig snap behind you or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, remember my story, remember the Jaeger, and whatever you do, don't look back, because you never know what might be gaining on you in the darkness. My name is David Rodriguez. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1992 when I was 46. I've kept this story to myself for over 3 decades, but now, as I feel the weight of my years pressing down on me, I think it's time to share it. Maybe someone out there can make sense of what happened to me. Or maybe it'll serve as a warning to those who think they can venture into the wild places of this world without consequence. I've never been much of a storyteller, but I'll do my best to lay it out straight. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those eyes haunting me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was early June. I'd finally saved up enough to buy a used RV, a 1985 Winnebago Chieftain. She wasn't much to look at with her faded paint and a few dents here and there, but to me she was freedom on wheels. I'd been working as a mechanic in Little Rock for the better part of 2 decades, and the idea of hitting the open road had been calling to me for years. I remember the day I decided to take her out for her first real spin. The air was thick with humidity, typical for Arkansas that time of year. Cicadas were singing their endless summer song, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. I'd heard about a quiet spot in the Ouachita National Forest from a buddy of mine, Joe Hawkins. Joe was an avid hunter and knew those woods like the back of his hand. Dave, he'd said to me over beers one night, "If you want real peace and quiet, head out to Ouachita. There's a spot near Lake Ouachita off the beaten path. You won't find it on any map, but God's country out there." He'd given me rough directions, more of a general area than a specific location, but that was fine by me. I was looking for an adventure, a chance to unwind and disconnect from the world. Little did I know what kind of adventure I was in for. I packed up their RV with enough supplies for a week, canned goods, fishing gear, a couple of books I've been meaning to read, and of course a cooler full of beer. I said goodbye to my neighbor, old Mrs. Thompson, and told her I'd be back in a week or so. She waved from her porch, her face etched with concern. "You be careful out there, David," she called. "Those woods can be dangerous for a city boy like you." I laughed it off at the time. Mrs. Thompson was always worrying about something or other, but looking back, I wonder if she knew something I didn't. The drive out of Little Rock was uneventful. I headed west on I-30, then south on US 7. The further I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. The radio crackled with static, the only station I could pick up playing country songs I didn't recognize. But that was fine by me. The hum of the road and the occasional twang from the speakers were all the company I needed. As I turned onto the smaller roads leading into the Ouachita National Forest, the world seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their canopies blocking out much of the sky. The air felt different too. Cooler, damper, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I rolled down the windows, letting the forest air fill the RV. It was late afternoon by the time I started looking for a place to camp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The winding roads had become little more than dirt tracks. and I was starting to worry that I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But then, just as I was considering turning back, I saw it, a small clearing by a lake, hidden from the main road by a thick stand of trees. I carefully maneuvered the RV into the clearing, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out, I was struck by the silence. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. The lake was small but beautiful, its surface like a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. Perfect, I muttered to myself, a smile spreading across my face. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. Setting up camp was simple enough. I leveled out the RV, hooked up the battery to power the essentials, and set up a folding chair by the lake. As the last light of day faded, I cracked open a beer and sat back, feeling the tension of the week melt away. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, so different from the constant background noise of the city. And as I sat there watching the stars come out one by one, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I figured I'd stay a couple of days, do some fishing, maybe read a book or two. It was supposed to be a break from the grind, a chance to recharge and come back to civilization refreshed. If only I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods. If only I'd listened to that nagging voice in the back of my mind that said something wasn't quite right. But hindsight, as they say. And I was about to learn that sometimes the price of seeking solitude can be higher than you ever imagined. As the evening wore on, I decided to fire up the small portable grill I'd brought along. There's something primal about cooking over an open flame, especially out in the wilderness. I had some burgers in the cooler, nothing fancy, just ground beef I'd shaped into patties before leaving home. The sizzle of the meat on the grill and the smell of it cooking should have been appetizing, but that's when I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell in the air, something that seemed out of place in the fresh forest atmosphere. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the scent of the cooking meat, but as I stood there, spatula in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The smell was wrong. It reminded me of sulfur, that rotten egg smell, but mixed with something else. Something worse, like rotting meat, but not quite. I wrinkled my nose looking around the clearing. The lake was calm, reflecting the last remnants of twilight. The trees stood silent sentinels at the edge of the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place but that smell. I shook my head trying to clear it. Maybe it was just some stagnant water nearby or decaying vegetation. That had to be it. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a part of me knew better. In all my years of camping and hunting, I never smelled anything quite like this. It was alien, out of place, and it set my teeth on edge. I finished cooking the burgers, but found my appetite had waned. I managed to eat one, washing it down with another beer, but the second patty went uneaten. As I cleaned up, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the encroaching darkness and that persistent, unsettling smell. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the forest. The clearing was plunged into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow up the beam of my flashlight. The stars, at least, were brilliant. Without the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a dazzling display. Under different circumstances, I would have sat out for hours just stargazing. But that night I felt an urge to be inside, behind locked doors. I secured everything outside, making sure the grill was completely out and storing the cooler in the RV's small exterior compartment. As I did my final check, I noticed the smell had faded. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe it was just my city senses adjusting to the unfamiliar forest scents. Inside the RV, things felt more normal. The space was cozy, if a bit cramped. I had a small table that doubled as a workspace, a surprisingly comfortable bed, and a kitchenette that was more functional than fancy. I brought along a few books, some Louis L'Amour westerns and a Stephen King novel I've been meaning to get around to. I settled in with one of the Lemore books, reading by the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. But I couldn't focus on my words. My mind kept drifting back to that smell, to the feeling of being watched. I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside, but there was nothing except the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, fatigue began to set in. The drive, the fresh air, and the beers had taken their toll. I marked my place in the book and got ready for bed. As I lay there in the darkness, I could hear the wind picking up, whistling through the trees. It was a lonely sound, reminding me of just how isolated I was out here. My last conscious thought before drifting off was a note to myself to check the RV's propane lines in the morning. Maybe that was the source of the sulfur smell. It was a comforting thought, a rational explanation that allowed me to finally relax and let sleep take me. If only I'd stayed awake a little longer. If only I'd been more alert. Maybe I would have heard it coming. Maybe I would have had a chance to leave before things went so terribly wrong. But I slept unaware that something out there in the darkness had taken notice of me, and it was getting closer. I'm not sure how long I slept, but I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. The inside of the RV was pitch black and the silence was absolute. When I heard it, the sound that must have woken me. It was a scratching noise coming from outside. At first I thought it might be a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but as I listened I realized it was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like nails on metal, a slow, methodical scratching that sent shivers down my spine. My first rational thought was raccoons. They can be pretty bold, and I wouldn't have been surprised to find them trying to get into the cooler. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't right. The sound was too loud, too powerful to be made by something as small as a raccoon. I lay there in the darkness, barely breathing, just listening. The scratching continued, moving slowly along the side of the RV. Whatever was making the noise was big. My mind, still foggy with sleep, conjured images of bears, mountain lions, impossible monsters with claws like knives. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there and wait for whatever it was to find its way inside. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the small bedside table. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The scratching stopped abruptly. Had it heard me move? I held my breath, straining my ears. The silence stretched on, broken only by the pounding of my heart. So loud I was sure it must be audible outside. And I heard something else. A low rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it filled me with a primal instinctive fear. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I knew I had to look. I had to see what was out there. With a trembling hand, I reached for the curtain covering the small window near my bed. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers on the fabric. Did I really want to see what was making those sounds? What if it saw me? The decision was made for me when something heavy slammed against the side of the RV, rocking it on its wheels. I let out an involuntary yelp, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. In one motion, I yanked back the curtain and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. For a split second, I saw something, a shape, dark and massive, moving with impossible speed at the edge of the light. Then it was gone, vanishing into the tree line so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I sat there, flashlight trained on the spot where I'd seen the shape for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had been big, that much I was sure of. Bigger than a bear and shaped all wrong. But beyond that, I couldn't say. It had moved so fast, been there and gone in the blink of an eye. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of other things. The smell was back, stronger than ever. That sulphurous, rotting odor seemed to permeate everything. And more something else, a sense of wrongness in the air, as if reality itself had been warped by whatever had visited that night. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other, watching the windows and listening for any sound of its return. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest and that lingering, awful smell. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Whatever had been out there seemed to have gone, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be staying another night in this clearing. As soon as it was fully light, I was going to pack up and move on, maybe find a campground with other people around, or maybe just head back to civilization altogether. Little did I know my encounter that night was just the beginning. The true terror was yet to come. The sun rose slowly, as if it too were hesitant to shed light on whatever had transpired during the night. As soon as it was bright enough to see clearly, I cautiously stepped out of the RV, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. The morning was crisp and cool, with a light mist hanging over the lake. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, but all I could focus on were the marks on the side of the RV. They were unmistakable, far-long parallel gouges running along the metal siding. They started about halfway up and ran almost to the ground. Whatever had made them had some serious claws. I ran my fingers along the marks, feeling the depth of them. These weren't just surface scratches, the metal was deeply scored. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized how close the thing had been. Only a thin metal wall had separated me from whatever had made these marks. And judging by the height of the scratches, it had been big, much bigger than I'd initially thought. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a bear. A big one, sure, but still just a bear. They were known to roam these parts after all. But even as I had the thought, I knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't move the way that thing had moved. They didn't disappear into the night like a shadow. And they certainly didn't leave behind that god-awful smell, which I noticed was still lingering in the air. I did a quick circuit of the clearing, looking for tracks or any other signs of what had visited in the night. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, not great for leaving prints. But near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was a bit softer, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, but not like any animal prints I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and all were shaped like a bear's paw or any other creature I could think of. They were almost human-like, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I stared at the prints, trying to make sense of them. What kind of creature could have left these? The mind flashed back to stories I'd heard as a kid. Tales of Bigfoot and other mysterious beasts said to roam the wilderness. But this seemed like something else entirely. As I stood there, lost in thought, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing, just the trees, their branches moving slightly in the morning breeze. That was enough for me. Whatever was out here, whatever had visited in the night, I wanted no part of it. I practically ran back to the RV, my earlier bravado completely forgotten. I had to get out of here. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing my gear haphazardly into the RV. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. My only thought was putting as much distance between myself and this clearing as possible. As I was about to start the engine, I took one last look around. The forest seemed different now, darker somehow, despite the morning sunlight. I could have sworn I saw movement in the tree line, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. I gunned the engine and pulled out of the clearing, tires spinning on the loose dirt. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing after the RV. But the road behind me remained empty. I drove non-stop for several hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't have a clear destination in mind, I just knew I needed to put distance between myself and whatever I'd encountered in that clearing. The forest gradually thinned out, giving way to more open country. When I finally saw signs for a small town called Mina, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The normality of the place, the hum of the refrigerators, the ding of the bell as customers came and went, was almost shocking after the otherworldly experience of the night before. I went inside to pay for gas and grab a much-needed coffee. The attendant, an older guy with a grizzled beard and a name tag that read Earl, took one look at my pale face and wild eyes and asked if I was all right. I hesitated for a moment. How could I possibly explain what had happened? But something in Earl's expression, a mixture of concern and knowing, made me open up. I told him about the footprints, the smell, the eyes I'd seen in the darkness. As I spoke, Earl's expression grew more serious. When I finished, he nodded slowly as if he'd heard it all before. "Sounds like you met the Kush Taka," he said, his voice low and serious. "The what?" I asked, confused. "Kush Taka," Earl repeated. "Old folks around here have stories about it. They say it's a shapeshifter, a creature that can take on human form but isn't human at all. Is drawn to the scent of fear and loneliness." I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a local legend. But something about Earl's tone, the way his eyes looked right through me, made me uneasy. "Listen, son," Earl said, leaning in close. "Whatever you do, don't go back into those woods alone. The Kushtaka, they say it likes to lure people deeper into the forest. And those that follow, well, they don't come back." I thanked Earl for the warning and paid for my gas, then hurried back to the RV. As I pulled out of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape, but at least I was out of those woods now. I decided to head straight back to Little Rock, back to the safety of civilization. The drive back to Little Rock was uneventful, but I couldn't relax. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every dark patch of forest along the highway seemed to hide watching eyes. I kept the radio on loud, tuned to a talk station, just to have some human voices to keep me company. It was late afternoon by the time I pulled into my driveway. Mrs. Thompson was out on her porch again, and she waved as I parked the RV. I waved back, managing a weak smile. How could I explain that her warning had been more accurate than either of us could have imagined? That night, safe in my own bed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd eaten some bad food, or the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those inhuman eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It's been over 3 decades since that night in the Ouachita National Forest, but I've never forgotten it. I've never gone back to those woods, and I've never camped alone again. The RV sat in my driveway for years. The scratches on its side a constant reminder of what I encountered. I sold it eventually, but I never told the buyer about its history. Some nights when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still smell that sickly sulfurous odor. In my dreams, I'm back in that clearing and something is circling the RV, scratching, trying to get in. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was the Kushitaka that Earl talked about, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely go. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to escape. Whatever was out there did let me go. Or maybe it's just biding its time, waiting for me to let my guard down. So if you're ever in the Ouachita National Forest, and you find a secluded spot that seems too perfect, think twice before you set up camp. And if you smell something strange on the night air, like sulfur and rotting meat, don't ignore it like I did. Pack up and leave. Strive until you hit civilization. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because something is out there in those woods, and it's hungry. August 5th. The sun was just beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains as I maneuvered my weathered RV along the winding Montana back roads. At 70 years old, I found a certain comfort in the familiar rumble of the engine and the creak of the suspension as we climbed higher into the wilderness. My name is Joseph Wilson, and this is the story of a camping trip that would change my life forever. The idea for this solo expedition had been brewing in my mind for weeks. Working as an insurance claims adjuster in Missoula wasn't exactly the most thrilling profession for a man my age. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful for the stability it provided, but there was always a part of me that yearned for adventure. That's why every few months I'd pack up my trusty RV and head out into the wilderness, seeking solitude and a break from the monotony of everyday life. This particular trip had been meticulously planned. I had enough supplies to last a week, canned goods, bottled water, a few choice books, and my trusty fishing rod. The Bitterroot Mountains had always held a special allure for me. Their rugged beauty and vast expanses of untamed wilderness spoke to something primal in my soul. As I drove deeper into the forest, the last vestiges of civilization faded away. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to little more than a dirt track. The thick pines pressed in on either side, their branches scraping against the sides of the RV like gnarled fingers. I couldn't help but feel a small thrill of excitement mixed with a touch of apprehension. Out here, I was truly on my own. After about an hour of careful navigation, I finally spotted the perfect clearing. It was a small opening in the dense forest, maybe 50 feet across, with a babbling stream cutting through one corner. The ground was relatively flat, covered in a soft carpet of pine needles and moss. It was exactly what I had been hoping to find. With practiced ease, I backed the RV into position, making sure to leave enough room for my tent. Even though I had the comfort of the RV, there was something about sleeping under canvas that made me feel more connected to nature. Plus, at my age, it was good to remind myself that I could still rough it when I wanted to. As I stepped out of the RV, the crisp mountain air filled my lungs. The scent of pine and earth was intoxicating. I took a moment to stretch, my old bones creaking almost as much as the RV had on the drive up. The sun had fully set now, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. I set about making camp with the efficiency of long practice. First, I called a space for my fire pit, carefully arranging stones in a circle. Then I gathered some dry wood from the edge of the clearing. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a curious deer or maybe even a bear, but each time there was nothing but the silent, dark forest. With the fire crackling merrily, I turned my attention to setting up the tent. It was a mulled two-person affair, faded green canvas that had seen better days but still kept out the rain and wind. As I hammered in the last tent peg, a cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that made me pause. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but for a moment I could have sworn I heard singing or maybe chanting. I straightened up, straining my ears, but the sound, if it had been there at all, was gone. "Getting jumpy in your old age, Joe," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on me, or maybe some far-off campers enjoying their own fire. With camp set up, I settled into my folding chair by the fire, a cold beer in one hand and my dog-eared copy of Moby Dick in the other. As the flames danced and the stars wheeled overhead, I felt the tension of the city beginning to melt away. This was what I had come for: peace, solitude, and the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. As I read occasionally, sipping my beer, I found my mind wandering. I thought about my life back in Missoula, my small apartment, and the office where I spent my days poring over accident reports and medical bills. It wasn't a bad life, but sitting here in the wilderness, I couldn't help but wonder if I had missed out on something. Maybe I should have taken more risks, sought out more adventures when I was younger. I was jolted from my reverie by a sudden crack from the forest. My head snapped up and my eyes strained to penetrate the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Probably just a deer, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive, as if it were closing in around me. Deciding it was time to turn in, I doused the fire and retreated to my tent. As I zipped up the entrance, I could have sworn I heard that faint chanting again, carried on the night breeze. But by the time I had my ear pressed against the canvas, straining to listen, it was gone. Sleep came fitfully that night. My dreams were a confused jumble of shadowy figures moving through the trees and eerie, discordant music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. More than once I jerked awake, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something moving just outside the tent. But each time, there was nothing but the quiet whisper of wind through the pines. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the canvas, I gave up on sleep entirely. I emerged from the tent, stretching my stiff muscles and breathing in the cool morning air. The Chloe looked exactly as I had left it the night before, no sign of any nocturnal visitors. As I set about rekindling the fire and brewing a pot of coffee, I tried to shake off the unease that had plagued me through the night. "You're out here to relax, old man," I told myself sternly. "Stop jumping at shadows." Little did I know, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sun climb over the mountains, that this was only the beginning. The true test of my courage and sanity was yet to come. The next few days passed without incident, and I slowly began to relax into the rhythm of camping life. I spent my mornings exploring the area around my campsites, taking long hikes through the dense forests. The Bitterroot Mountains were truly breathtaking, with their towering pines, crystal clear streams, and occasional meadows bursting with wildflowers. On the third day of my trip, I decided to venture a bit further from camp. I packed a small day pack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit. At my age, it paid to be prepared. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool and crisp, with a gentle breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. As I made my way along a faint game trail, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not many 70-year-olds would be out here, miles from civilization, trekking through the wilderness. It was a reminder that I still had some adventure left in me, despite the creaks in my joints and the gray in my hair. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across a small clearing. It was there that I had my first truly strange encounter of the trip. As I stepped out of the trees, I nearly collided with two men coming from the opposite direction. They were both in their mid-30s, wearing expensive-looking hiking gear that seemed barely used. "Oh. Hello there," I said, recovering from my surprise. "Didn't expect to run into anyone else out here." The two men exchanged a glance before the taller of the two spoke. "Yeah, same here. We're just out for a short trip from Billy." Something about their manner struck me as odd. They seemed tense, almost nervous, their eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out at them from the undergrowth. "Everything all right?" I asked, concerned, my voice creeping in. "You boys look a bit spooked." The shorter man forced a laugh. "No, we're good. Just, keeping an eye out for bears and such." We chatted for a few more minutes, exchanging pleasantries and trail information. They introduced themselves as Mike and Dave, but didn't offer last names. As we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were holding something back. Their responses were clipped, and they kept glancing at each other as if silently communicating. "Well, you two take care now," I said finally, deciding it was best to move on. The mountains can be unpredictable. Stay safe out there. As I turned to continue on my way, I heard Mike mutter something to Dave. I only caught a few words, "shouldn't be here," and "have to warn." Before they were out of earshot, a chill ran down my spine, and for the first time since starting my trip, I felt truly uneasy. The rest of my hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the memory of that strange encounter. What had those men been so nervous about? What did they think they needed to warn someone about? As I made my way back to camp, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, suddenly aware of how isolated I was out here. That night, as I sat by my campfire nursing a cup of instant coffee, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed different somehow. The familiar sounds of the wilderness took on a sinister quality. The crack of a branch in the darkness made me jump, spilling hot coffee on my hand. As I sucked at the minor burn, I heard it again, that faint, eerie chanting I had dismissed on my first night. This time it was clearer, closer. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the stream. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, straining my ears to catch the sound. The chanting grew louder, more distinct. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, not quite language, but not random noise either. It had a rhythm to it, a pattern that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bone. And underneath it all was a sense of age, something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stay put, to ignore the sound and go to bed. But something stronger was pulling me towards the stream, a curiosity that overrode my fear. As I approached the water, the chanting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost painful in its intensity. I played my flashlight beam across the surface of the stream, half expecting to see what cultists performing some arcane ritual, a group of campers playing an elaborate prank. What I saw instead nearly stopped my heart. There, caught in an eddy near the bank, was a burlap sack. It was old and rotting, barely held together by fraying threads. As my flashlight beam fell on it, I saw something poking out of a tear in the fabric, something white and curved. With trembling hands, I reached out and grabbed the sack, pulling it from the water. It was heavier than I expected, and as I laid it on the bank, a horrible smell assaulted my nostrils, the unmistakable stench of decay. I knew I should leave it alone. I knew I should go back to my camp, pack up, and get the hell out of these mountains. But that same morbid curiosity that had drawn me to the stream now compelled me to open the sack. As I pulled apart the rotting burlap, my worst fears were confirmed. Inside were bones, human bones. A skull grinned up at me, its empty eye sockets seeming to accuse me of disturbing its rest. There were other bones too, ribs, vertebrae, what looked like part of a pelvis, all old, all stained dark with time in the water of the stream. I scrambled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was wrong. This was all wrong. People didn't just find human remains on a camping trip. This kind of thing happened in movies and books, not in real life. Not to insurance adjusters from Missoula on a quiet camping trip. As I stood there, my mind reeling, trying to process what I had just seen, I became aware of a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking wildly as my hand trembled. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct in the darkness. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw the flash of inhuman eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I ran faster than I had in years. My old joints protesting as I sprinted back to my campsite. I burst into my RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. As I huddled there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, I realized two things. First, I was no longer alone in these mountains. Something was out there, something that defied rational explanation. And second, I was in way over my head. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I kept replaying the events of the evening in my mind, the chanting, the bones, that impossible figure at the edge of the trees. By the time dawn broke, I had convinced myself that I needed to leave to get back to civilization and report what I had found. But as the sun rose and bathed the clearing in warm golden light, my fear began to fade. In the harsh light of day, the events of the previous night seemed, if not less real, then at least less immediate. I found myself rationalizing, trying to find logical explanations for what I had experienced. The bones could have been old, very old. Perhaps they were Native American remains washed down from some long-forgotten burial site. The chanting could have been the wind or distant campers, or even just my imagination playing tricks on me. And the figure. Well, I was tired, scared, and it was dark. It could have been a bear standing on its hind legs, or just a trick of the shadows. As I sat outside the RV, nursing a strong cup of coffee and watching the morning mist rise from the stream, I made a decision. I would stay, at least for now, but I would be more careful. No more wandering around in the dark, no more following strange sound. I was here to relax and enjoy nature, and that's exactly what I was going to do. With that resolution made, I set about preparing for a day hike. I packed more supplies than usual: extra water, a first aid kit, an emergency blanket, and even a small can of bear spray that I had brought along just in case. Better safe than sorry, especially after last night's scare. I set off in a different direction from yesterday's hike, hoping to cover new ground and perhaps put some distance between myself and the site of last night's disturbing discovery. Today was beautiful, warm, but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. As I walked, I found my spirits lifting. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals going about their business. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was hard to believe that just hours ago this same forest had seemed so menacing. After a couple of hours of steady hiking, I came across something unexpected: a small cabin nestled in a tiny clearing. It was old, that much was clear from the weathered wood and sagging roof. Vines and moss covered much of the structure, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming it. Curiosity piqued. I approached cautiously. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the windows were long since broken, leaving dark, empty sockets in the walls. It looked as though no one had been here in years, maybe decades. "Hello?" I called out, more out of habit than any real expectation of a response. As expected, only silence answered me. I knew I should probably leave well enough alone. After all, hadn't I just resolved to be more careful? But the mystery of this abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere was too intriguing to ignore. With a deep breath, I stepped through the doorway. The interior of the cabin was a mess. Just as I had expected, a thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by the small tracks of animals that had made this place their home. Old furniture lay scattered about: a broken table, a chair with only 3 legs, and a rusted iron stove in one corner. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and abandonment. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something odd about the walls. They were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something with enormous claws had tried to tear its way out. Or perhaps a chilling thought occurred to me: tear its way in. I approached one of the walls, running my fingers lightly over the gouges. They were deep, much deeper than anything a bear or mountain lion could have made, and there was a pattern to them, almost like a sudden noise from outside made me jump. I spun around, heart pounding, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure from the night before looming in the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the gentle sway of trees in the breeze. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I decided it was time to leave. This place was giving me the creeps. I'd seen enough. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. There in the far corner of the cabin, partially hidden by the collapsed remains of what might have been a bed, was a book. Against my better judgment, I crossed the room and picked it up. It was old, the leather cover cracked and faded. There was no title. Instead, a strange symbol was embossed on the front, a twisted tree with what looked like faces peering out from its bark. I opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might crumble in my hands. It was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. As I skimmed the first page, my blood ran cold. It was a journal dated 1932. The first entry read, August 15th. The chanting has started again. It's closer this time. I feel the guardian has found me. God help me. I should never have come to these cursed mountains. I slammed the book shut, my hand shaking. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of joke. A prop left here by pranksters, or maybe for a movie shoot. But deep down I knew this was real, and I was in way over my head. I shoved the book into my backpack and practically ran from the cabin. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, every shadow potentially hiding unspeakable horrors. I made it back to my campsite in record time, my lungs burning and legs aching from the exertion. As I burst into the clearing, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, right in the middle of my campsite, was a symbol drawn in the dirt. The same twisted tree from the cover covered the book. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the RV, not bothering to pack properly. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. An impossibly tall figure was there again watching me. This time I was sure I wasn't imagining things. I floored the accelerator, the RV bouncing wildly as I sped down the rough forest road. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As the miles between me and those mountains grew, I began to calm down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, whatever that guardian was, it had noticed me. And something told me it wasn't done with me yet. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the Bitterroot Mountains. It wasn't until I saw the familiar skyline of Missoula that I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Home, safety, normalcy. But as I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I realized that nothing would ever be truly normal again. The events of the past few days had shaken me to my core, challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. I spent the next week in a daze, going through the motions at work, but unable to focus on anything but what I had experienced. The chanting, the bones, the cabin, the journal, it all swirled in my mind. A puzzle I couldn't solve, but couldn't ignore. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. They would believe me. I could barely believe it myself. Instead, I threw myself into research, spending my evenings hunched over my computer, searching for any information I could find about the Bitterroot Mountains and their legends. Most of what I found was typical tourist information, hiking trails, camping spots, local flora and fauna. But buried deep in forum posts and obscure local history websites, I began to find hints, whispers of something ancient in those mountains. Stories of hikers gone missing, of strange sounds in the night, of shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees. One name kept coming up, always in hushed tones, always with a sense of fear and reverence. Nasher, the guardian of the forest. An ancient spirit, some said, a protector of the land, others claimed, a vengeful entity that punished those who disrespected the mountains. The more I read, the more certain I became that this Nasher was what I had encountered. But why me? I'd always respected nature, had always been careful to leave no trace when I camped. What had I done to draw its attention? As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a pull, a need to go back to find answers. The fear kept me rooted in Missoula, jumping at shadows and starting awake at night. Sure, I could hear that eerie chanting in the distance. It was nearly a month after my return when I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Bill Turner, the sheriff from the small town nearest to where I had been camping. "Mr. Wilson?" His gruff voice came through the line. "This is Sheriff Turner. We need to talk about what you saw in the mountains. My heart raced. I don't know what you mean, I stammered, afraid of sounding crazy if I told the truth. Don't play dumb with me, son, he growled. 2 hikers went missing in those mountains the day after you left, men matching the description of those fellas you said you ran into. Now, are you going to tell me what really happened up there? Or do I need to come to Missoula and ask you in person? The blood drained from my face as I thought about those 2 men from Billings, Mike and Dave. If they were missing or worse, they'll come to you, I heard myself saying. They'll tell you everything I know. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my quiet life as an insurance adjuster was over. Whatever was happening in those mountains, I was a part of it now. And I had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, much darker story. With shaking hands, I began to pack a bag. I was going back to the Bitterroot Mountains, back to face whatever waited for me there. Because now I knew running away wasn't an option. The Guardian had marked me, and one way or another I had to see this through to the end. As I zipped up my duffel bag, my eyes fell on the old leather-bound journal I had taken from the cabin. I hadn't been able to bring myself to read more of it since that day. But now I needed every scrap of information I could get. With a deep breath, I opened the book and began to read. As the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across my living room, I delved deeper into the mystery of the Bitterroot Guardian. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a journey that would change not just my life but my understanding of the world itself. The drive back to the small town near the Bitterroot Mountains was tense. Every mile brought back memories of my hasty retreat from the terror I had felt, but it also brought a strange sense of anticipation. I was going back, yes, but this time I wasn't alone. This time I had a purpose. Sheriff Bill Turner was waiting for me when I pulled into the parking lot of the local diner. He was a bear of a man, his craggy face weathered by years in the sun, his eyes sharp and assessing as I approached. Mr. Wilson, he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, calloused. Glad you could make it. Let's talk inside. Over cups of strong, bitter coffee, I told him everything. The chanting, the bones in the stream, the abandoned cabin, and the journal. To his credit, Sheriff Turner listened without interruption, his face impassive. When I finished, he sat back, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. That's quite a story, Mr. Wilson, he said finally. In most places, I'd say you were spinning yarns or had one too many out there in the woods. This is Bitterroot. He leaned forward, his voice low. Things happen in these mountains, Mr. Wilson. Things that don't make it into the official reports. You've had missing hikers before, strange sightings, unexplained sounds. Most folks write it off as bears or mountain lions or overactive imaginations. But some of us know better. A chill ran down my spine. You've seen it too, I said. It wasn't a question. Sheriff Turner nodded slowly. Once, years ago, I was a young deputy, cocky as they come. Thought I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. Then one night I saw something tall as a tree moving through the forest like a shadow. Heard that chanting you mentioned. Nearly scared me out of my wits. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the cold bitterness. Since then I've kept my eyes and ears open, gathered what information I could. And I'll tell you this, Mr. Wilson, whatever's out there, it's old. Older than these mountains, maybe, and it doesn't take kindly to being disturbed. I pulled out the journal I found in the cabin, sliding it across the table to him. What about this? Have you ever seen anything like it before? Sheriff Turner's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. Where did you get this? He demanded. In the cabin, like I said. Why do you recognize it? He closed the book carefully as if afraid it might bite. There are stories, he said slowly. Old stories passed down by the local tribes. They speak of a book of secrets, a record of the Guardian and its ways. It was supposed to have been lost decades ago. If this is what I think it is, Mr. Wilson, you may have stumbled onto something bigger than either of us realized. Just then, the diner's door burst open. A young deputy, barely out of his teens by the look of him, rushed in. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "Sheriff?" he gasped. "You need to come quick. We found them." "Found who?" Sheriff Turner was on his feet in an instant. "We're missing hikers," the deputy said. "Or what's left of them." The drive to the trailhead was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. As we bumped along the forest road, I couldn't help but feel we were driving towards something momentous, a turning point from which there would be no return. The scene at the trailhead was chaotic. Police cars and an ambulance had their lights flashing, casting eerie red and blue shadows through the trees. A small crowd of hikers and locals had gathered, held back by a hastily erected police line. Sheriff Turner flashed his badge, ushering me through with him. "He was with me," he growled at a deputy, who looked like he might object. What I saw beyond the police line would haunt me for years to come. 2 body bags lay on the ground, surrounded by crime scene markers. Then it was what was beyond them that caught my eye. There, carved into the trunk of a massive old pine, was a symbol, the twisted tree from the journal, its bark faces leering in the harsh light of the police floodlights. And all around, scratched into the dirt and nearby rocks, were words. The same phrase over and over. "The guardian wakes. The forest remembers." As I stood there staring at this macabre scene, a sound reached my ears. Faint at first, then growing stronger. That familiar, eerie chanting echoing through the trees. Sheriff Turner grabbed my arm, his face grim. "We need to go." As we hurried back to his car, I glanced over my shoulder. There, just for a moment, I saw it again. That impossibly tall figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. I knew then that this was far from over. The guardian of Bitterroot was awake, and somehow I was caught in the middle of its ancient, inscrutable purpose. As Sheriff Turner's car sped away from the scene, I clutched the old journal to my chest. Whatever answers we needed, I was sure they lay within its pages. And I had a feeling we were going to need those answers sooner rather than later. The guardian was calling, and like it or not, I had to answer. The next few days were a blur of activity. Sheriff Turner had set up a makeshift command center in the back room of the local library, away from prying eyes and curious ears. We spent hours poring over the journal, cross-referencing its cryptic entries with local legends and historical records. The journal, it turned out, was far more than just a record of one person's encounter with the Guardian. It was a compilation of accounts spanning centuries, passed down through generations of secret keepers. The writer of the last entry, dated 1932, had been merely the latest in a long line of custodians. As we delved deeper into its pages, a chilling picture began to emerge. The Guardian, or Nasher as it was sometimes called, was not just a protector of the forest, it was a judge, jury, and executioner for those who violated the sacred laws of the land. But what those laws were exactly remained frustratingly vague. Some entries spoke of trespassers being punished, others of offerings being made to appease the Guardian. There were accounts of entire logging camps disappearing overnight, of prospectors driven mad by ceaseless chanting, of hikers found wandering the woods, babbling about faces in the trees. "This doesn't make sense," I said one evening, rubbing my tired eyes. "If this thing is real, why hasn't anyone ever captured evidence of it?" In this day and age, with cameras everywhere, Sheriff Turner snorted. "You really think a being that survived this long would let itself be caught on camera? Besides, look at this." He pointed to a passage in the journal. "The Guardian exists between worlds. It's not fully in our reality. That's why it's so hard to see. Why it appears as a shadow or a trick of the light." I shook my head, still struggling to accept what we were dealing with.
But why now?
Why is it suddenly so active? And what does it want with me? The sheriff's face grew grim. That's what worries me. According to this, the Guardian only becomes active when there's a great threat to the forest, something big enough to rouse it from its slumber. A chill ran down my spine. You don't think that whatever's coming is bigger than a few careless hikers or overzealous loggers, Sheriff Turner said slowly, and for some reason it's chosen you to be involved. As if on cue, a deputy burst into the room. Sheriff, you need to see this. We followed him out to the main street of the small town. What we saw made my blood run cold. Every tree lining the street had the Guardian symbol carved into its trunk, and in the distance, echoing from the mountains, we could hear it. The chanting had begun again. Sheriff Turner turned to me, his face pale but determined. I think it's time we stopped reacting and started acting. Whatever this thing wants, we need to face it head on. I nodded, fear and determination warring in my gut. Where do we start? The sheriff's gaze turned to the mountains looming over the town. We go back to where it all began. Your campsite, your cabin. We need to find the source of all this. As I prepared for what felt like a final confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The Guardian, this ancient entity, had chosen to reveal itself now after centuries of secrecy. Why? What had changed? Little did I know that the answer to that question would shake not just our small town, but the entire world to its core. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but an undeniable tension filled the air. Sheriff Turner, myself, and a small team of deputies prepared for our expedition into the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains. We were armed with a journal, maps of the area, and enough supplies to last several days. Despite the sheriff's insistence, I refused to carry a gun. Something told me that conventional weapons would be useless against what we were about to face. As we drove toward my old campsite, I couldn't help but notice how the forest had changed. The trees seemed to press closer to the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on them. And underneath it all was a low, thrumming energy as if the very earth was holding its breath in anticipation. We reached the path to my campsite by midday. The old dirt road was nearly overgrown now, forcing us to continue on foot. As we hiked, I recounted my experiences to the group, pointing out landmarks I recognized. When we reached the stream where I had found the sack of bones, we all fell silent. The water ran clear and innocent, giving no hint of the horrors it had witnessed. It was late afternoon by the time we reached the abandoned cabin. It looked even more decrepit than I remembered, the roof now partially caved in. But the symbol of the twisted tree was still clearly visible, carved into the weathered wood of the door. Well, I'll be damned, Sheriff Turner muttered, running his hand over the carving. It's just like in the journal. We set up camp nearby, none of us willing to sleep inside the cabin itself. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underneath it all was something else. A rhythm, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat. Do you hear that? I asked, seeing the others straining to listen. Sheriff Turner nodded grimly. It's starting. As if triggered by his words, the chanting began. It was louder than I had ever heard it before, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The deputies huddled closer to the fire, their hands straying to their weapons. And then, at the edge of our camp, it appeared. The Guardian of Bitterroot was even more awe-inspiring and terrifying than I remembered. It towered over us, its form shifting and swirling like living shadow. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of darkness punctuated by pinpricks of light like distant stars. For a long moment, nobody moved. We were frozen, caught between fear and wonder. Then, slowly, deliberately, the Guardian raised one impossibly long arm and pointed. Not at us, but beyond us, deeper into the forest. Sheriff Turner was the first to find his voice. I think it wants us to follow. Amidst every instinct of self-preservation, we did just that. We followed the Guardian as it glided through the forest, the trees seeming to part before it. The chanting grew louder with every step, filling our heads until it was hard to think of anything else. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, we emerged into a massive clearing. At its center stood the largest tree I had ever seen, its trunk so wide that it would take a dozen people to encircle it. And carved into its bark, covering every inch of its surface, was writing the same script as in the journal, telling a story older than humanity itself. The Guardian stopped before the tree, turning to face us. When it spoke, it was with words, but with images and feelings that flooded our minds. We saw the forest as it had been thousands of years ago, pristine and untouched. We saw the first humans to enter this land and the pact they made with the spirit of the forest. We saw centuries of balance, of give and take between humans and nature, and then we saw what was coming, a great destruction fueled by greed and indifference. We saw the mountains torn open, the trees felled, the waters poisoned. We saw the end of everything the Guardian had protected for millennia. As the vision faded, I understood at last. It's not just about this forest, I gasped. It's about all of it. The whole world. Sheriff Turner nodded, his face ashen. It's showing us what will happen if we don't change course. The Guardian raised its arms and the giant tree began to glow with an inner light. Suddenly, I saw what we had to do. It's choosing us, I said, to be the new Guardians, to spread the message, to fight for the balance. One by one, we stepped forward, placing our hands on the tree. As we did, knowledge flooded into us, the secrets of the forest, the ways of nature, the delicate balance of all things. We became part of something greater than ourselves, a link in a chain stretching back to the dawn of time. When it was over, the Guardian was gone, but we could feel its presence all around us, in every tree, every leaf, every breath of wind. We're forever changed, entrusted with a mission greater than any we could have imagined. As we made our way back to town, I knew that our work was just beginning. We had a message to spread, a world to change. The Guardian of Bitterroot had awoken us to a higher purpose, and we would not let it down. The mines that would have poisoned the streams were never dug. Instead, the Bitterroot Mountains became a symbol of conservation, a place where humans and nature existed in harmony. And sometimes on quiet nights when the mood is full, I return to that clearing with the ancient tree. I place my hand on its bark and feel the pulse of the forest. And in the whisper of the wind through the leaves, I hear the Guardian's voice reminding me of the oath we took and the duty we bear. I am Joseph Wilson, once a simple insurance adjuster, now a guardian of nature's balance. My camping trip may have ended, but my true journey had only just begun. And as I stand here under the vast canopy of stars, I know that as long as there are those who remember, who respect, and who protect, the spirit of the forest will never truly sleep. The Guardian of Bitterroot watches over us all, a silent sentinel in a world learning at last to listen to the wisdom of the ancient forests.